In the previous video, we had completed the color tokens of our DSO from what we had taken from the project in Figma, remember? However, the color system expressed in this way is very basic. At the semantic level, it only expresses the primary color of the application and the secondary color. But it doesn't express things such as what color to apply for the background, what color to apply for texts that are titles on backgrounds, for common text on backgrounds, for text on images, and so on. The color system could represent the function of colors in the application in a much more semantic way. For example, this white, gray 00, could be used both as background color and as the color of a title on an image, both of hero and of cards, as well as for other text on images, such as those on these attractions cards. That is, in at least 3 different functions. If we give a name to these functions, surface color, color of titles on images, and color of text on images, we're building a color system that's truly more systemic, and of course, more semantic. It'll tell a lot more, and in a better way, about the application's design. It'll then be very easy to change, for example, the background color of the screens, or the color of the titles on images, or of the text on images. The task of building a good color system, that is, of identifying and abstracting its functions, is not so easy, but it's a very important task, which, if it's delayed, will degrade the system in the future. Therefore, it's advisable to focus on solving it as soon as possible, and then everything will go smoothly. At most, minor adjustments will have to be made. In general, this task is left to the designer, who already works more or less consciously with these abstractions. If your design tool doesn't provide that level of expressiveness, this is the case of Figma, which has that option in beta, you can send the front-end developer the system modeling in a spreadsheet, for example. This doesn't mean that we, front-end developers, even if we're not the ones building the model, have to understand it. Of course, if we don't have a designer, or the designer can't handle the systemization, we'll have to do it ourselves. So let's analyze this model that Chechu put together for me, and that I've been completing, for the color system of our application. First, we can see that it's designed in 3 levels of abstraction. The most basic, this one, corresponds to the color palette, where we simply give a name to each color of the palette and not much else. The second level is essential. It's built on the first one, and it's essential because it already corresponds to the global semantics of the colors in the application. It's going to model, then, the color system in the most general way possible. With the color styles that Chechu had created in Figma so far, we have a very basic combination of these 2 levels. Later, there may or may not be a third level, to specify the special cases that cannot be modeled with the generality given by the second level. That is to say, the second level is thought of as cross-cutting to the entire application, while the third level is much more specific to a particular component or part of the design. Let's analyze all this a little to understand it. Here we see tokens for the primary color, for the secondary color, for the highlighted primary color, we had already incorporated them before, and we're adding a token for the background color of the screens, this one. Then we see that tokens are being added to represent the colors of the elements that will be placed on background colors. Let's see examples to understand this. This is because every element of a layout has a background color. The background color, which may be transparent. For example, these 2 texts have a transparent background color, but this button does not. But these 2 controls are in turn inside another one, table or flex, it doesn't matter, which can also have a background color, or be transparent. And this one in turn are also inside a table or flex that may or may not have a background color. For example, look at what happens if I provide different background colors to several of these elements. In short, in every layout, there's a hierarchy of controls, some inside others, each one with a background color which may or may not be transparent. In the example of our design, the only background color that's not transparent, actually it's white, is that of the container. Well, except for the button, which has its light green background color. What I said a moment ago is not necessary either. The background color of this table could also be transparent, if the one that contains it has a white background color. It's our case. Do you remember that we had placed the background color at the level of the application class in the DSO so that it was universally valid for all layouts? Well, if you don't remember, don't worry, that's not the point now. What I want to pay attention to is the contrast required between the background and the foreground. This one, for example, can be a table or a cell of a table, and this other one. And that table or cell has a background color. In one case, the light green, in the other, the darker green. The controls that are inside have a transparent background color to be placed on that surface that's the background. But they also have their own color. In these cases of text, they're the color of the text, which has to contrast against that background surface, and that's all the designer's interested in, to achieve a good contrast between the superimposed elements, so that they can be displayed properly and are not confusing. The button can also be thought of in this way, as having a background color and the text of the button contrasting on it. So if we analyze the system from this perspective, we can see three background colors at work. This one, which we'll call surface, will correspond to the white color of the color palette. This one, which we call primary, is a green color of the color palette, light green. And this one, which we call secondary, corresponds to the other green. For the button, we also have the primary background color. But, as we were saying, a good contrast between the colors placed on these background colors is essential to achieve a successful design. If we look at the two elements that have a primary background, these two, we see the texts that are placed on that primary color correspond to the same color. Therefore, we can think of a token that specifies the color of the texts that are placed on a primary background. And that token is the one we call text on primary. Note that I'm already using the BEM naming convention to name that token. In this case, the value we'll give to the token is that of another token, the secondary one. But beyond that, it doesn't matter what value we give it. What matters is that we've just isolated, identified, a token that will perform this function to be text placed on a primary surface. And while we're here, we can also think about the colors of the text that will be placed on the surface. We see two types of differentiated elements, the color of the title and the color of a common text. Here, I'm not sure if it's clear that they're two different colors. But even if they're not, it's convenient to differentiate them because their functions are different, even if for the current design they were combined, which is not the case, because they're two different colors. But even if they were combined with the same value, it would still be good to separate them into two elements because they could change later and one could take a value and the other another value as they correspond to different concepts. So we can give them names that stand for the two different concepts. Title on surface, a title on the surface, and a text on the surface. In addition, we can think that images also act as backgrounds when elements are superimposed on them. Both the hero images in the page headers and the ones in all the carousels have text superimposed on them. Of what types? We have two cases, that of the titles on hero images and on the cards on one hand. It's the same color in both cases, and surely the designer has thought of it as a title on image concept. So we can call this color concept this way and not separate it into two, at least initially. On the other hand, the second case that we can identify is the text on image concept. For all these other cases, those of the rating on these cards and these other ones, and also for the location of the tourist attraction. And what about the menu items and these two words in the logo? In principle, we could use the same concept. Having analyzed all this, we already have the minimum semantic level. Will we need to add a third, specific level? And if so, how specific? Or have we already modeled the whole system with this? For example, as we said, in principle, we could use for the menu items the same color as for any other common text that's placed on an image, like these other ones. That's text on image. But we could also think that the color of a menu item has such a specificity that may deserve to be assigned a color concept of its own. In this design, we're implementing the menu to be always on the hero image, but this decision could change later on. We might want to give another color to the menu, so we'll need it to be independent from the other uses of text on image. This will be a specific concept of the menu component. It should even add the color of the bar that will be displayed to indicate the selected option, as we see here, which takes this green color, the primary one. Then we would add the third level because, although these colors will only apply to one component, and it wouldn't be so essential to isolate them as tokens, doing so improves the system's maintainability and consistency. I marked the first one because, actually, I assigned the same value as that of the text on image token, which clearly indicates that in principle, it would not be necessary that it is independent. This is the type of decision that we have to make, aiming for a balance. For a small system like ours, in principle, there's no disadvantage in this specialization. But as the system grows, the multiplication of particular cases clearly makes it more complex and degrades it. So, I suggest a balance. For example, we haven't modeled the color of this text. It's a text on an image, but not the white that we had for the other cases of text on an image. So we could define a second alternative token for text on an image at level 2 semantic, or we could define it specifically as at the level of the component where we'll find it, which I will name card home. Since it acts as a subtitle in that component, I'll call it that. I made this decision because the general token doesn't make much sense, since it doesn't seem to be general at all, but to be completely specific to this case. So I added it there with the value of the secondary token. You may rightly wonder why for this element I specified a token, card home title, if we had already seen that I could use the general one, title on image. It might seem that since I had to define a specific one for the subtitle, then for consistency purposes, it would be a good idea to define one for the title. However, it was because of a much stronger reason than that, and it has to do with something that we had not considered so far, which is this. This is the light mode. This is the dark mode. Chechu made another file, different from the one we were working with, where she added this mode. If we click down here and select the properties, on the color styles that we had, now we can see those of the dark mode. Although this is primary light, in this other one, primary dark is the secondary one. And the one that's secondary in dark mode will be the primary one in light mode. So in the spreadsheet, for each token, I will have to specify another column for the value taken by the token for the dark mode. The one we had, which said value, now I changed it to light, corresponded to light mode, which was the one we were working on. We have to make these associations. For each token, specify what its value is going to be in dark mode as well. So why did I tell you this? Because if we come here, we would have to inspect all of this now to see how the color varies according to the token. What I marked corresponds to when it's the same value in both modes. So what's not marked is what varies between one mode and the other. For example, let's start with the surface. While in light mode, it's this white, gray 00, which we have here. For the dark mode, it'll be this gray 800. We can see it clearly by selecting this, and we see gray 800. For the light mode, we already knew it was gray 00. As I was saying, not everything changes. For example, the color of the title on an image that corresponds to our title on image token is gray 00 for the light version, and for the dark version as well. It's not modified. Instead, let's see what happens with the title on a surface, title on surface. Here in dark mode, we can see that it's a white, it's gray 00, while in light mode, it was secondary. Those things are seen here. Surface, title on surface, secondary, gray 00. Meanwhile, title on image, the first one we had seen, keeps the same white color in both cases. Now, let's get to what I was asking you, which is what brought up this dark mode introduction. Why had I also isolated a token for the card home title? Instead of using, for example, the title on image? Because while this title on image, and even this title on image, does not change, we can see that it's still the same white. What about this one? Here we see that it's a sort of dark gray color. Well, note that here, Chechu's not using the color style. These are inconsistencies that, of course, can happen in any project, right? But clearly, this color is the same as that of the surface. It's the gray 800. Okay, but we were saying, here it's gray 800, while in light mode, it's this white. So we see that this color, the color of this title, behaves differently than the color of the titles on the images used for the generality of the application. It's therefore a particular case. And it's a particular case that only applies to the home cards and not to anything else. And that's why I made this decision, to define it as a component-specific token. Let's also see what I was saying before, that the primary token is going to be a type of green, green 200, which is the light green for the light mode, and the dark green for the dark mode, and vice versa, the reversed for the secondary token. Here note that the primary highlighted that the same primary token green 100 is using, I called it green 100, these don't vary for light and dark modes. They'll all have the same value for the two modes, except for this first one that I do vary for light and dark. And what color does this one correspond to? What color is this? The primary highlighted one. See that I have this primary highlighted for the light mode, and for the dark mode is this other one, which is lighter than the primary in both cases. That was the one we used precisely for the button too. Let's go to the button to show you the variations of the button when you hover over it. In the other file, we only had this, and in this one, we had the two versions, light and dark. And for the chatbot as well. I had also told you about it in the video where we talked about the images, but there I hadn't presented it yet because I didn't have this file. I didn't want to show you this file that the designer had given me. To make it easier to compare them, I'll have the two files at the same time. This is the previous one, which has the light mode only, and this is the one that has both modes. I'm going to select the dark mode for an easy comparison. Well, what should we see? That the tokens we have are enough to see if we don't have to create other tokens, as it happened with the token that we had associated with the card home for the title. So, for example, I want to see what happens with primary as background. For the light mode, we defined that with primary with the green one. Then we defined a text on primary token, which worked for both the button and the banner. Because the color of what was superimposed on that primary color, that is, text on primary, was always the same. In this case, in light mode, we knew that the primary was this green, and the on primary corresponded to the secondary one. What happens with the dark mode? Well, we see that they're reversed. What in the other case was primary, here is secondary, and vice versa. And that works for us, you see? Because then, what do we have to place here? We know that in this case, the primary is this one, and the secondary is the one that in the other case was the primary. It sounds like a tongue twister, but this is where you can understand why we gave it the same value when in fact it's not the same. What happens is that this secondary is referring to this secondary token that actually varies between one mode and the other. Note that there's an exception to this conversion from primary to secondary and from secondary to primary between light and dark modes. For example, in the chatbot, we see that what's primary and secondary is indeed reversed. The same for the button we had seen, the same for the banner. But what about the footer? Here that revision is not being done. The background color of the footer, that's this green for the secondary, is not turning into the primary green of the light mode. That is to say, this light green. If the same rule were followed, it would have to be this color. But it's this other one. So we can clearly see that this is an exception to this rule, which, if followed, should indicate that the secondary here should be the secondary here. That the secondary here is what? This one. And it's not happening. What color is it taking on instead? Gray 800. Then I create a special token, footer background color, precisely for that exception. It'll take the secondary color of the light mode. And for the dark mode, it'll take this gray 800. And what about the text on that background? We see that it's this color. If we go to light mode, it's the same one, gray 200. Therefore, I add this one as a token footer text. Because it'll not correspond to text on secondary, because it won't be, for example, the secondary background for the dark mode. It'll be this other one. It'll be this background color. So I need to add a special token. Text on secondary ended up like this. This is something to think about because we're not really using it. At first sight, with this color inversion that we're talking about, where the primary of one becomes the secondary of the other mode and vice versa, one could think that actually a text on secondary should be primary in both cases if this rule were followed. I'm going to leave the two values with a question mark because of what I was saying. At the moment, the only case of secondary as a background is this one, that of the footer. We don't have another case. To complete the expression of our whole color system, we still have to model only one part of it. Let's look at it here. It has to do with the contact panel, which is the only panel that has input fields. All the other panels have only output fields. Here the user will have to enter information and press the button. Note, I'm going to expand it a little more, that this text describing what the user has to enter in the next field takes this color, which is gray 600, which in this case is the same as any text on the background surface. So we would set as color that of the same token as this one. There's nothing to specialize there. However, note what happens with the text that appears inside here, which is a suggestion text. That is, it's not the description, but corresponds to indications for the user. Once the user starts typing, they disappear, unlike this one, which is a description that's always displayed. This is lighter color, not gray 600. It's gray 200 and corresponds to a different concept, which explains the color difference. And here's another type of color, that of the borders of these fields. The other fields did not have borders. This one does, and it's gray 200 too. So we still need to model two tokens, one for those borders and another for the text in these cases. And that's why I build two tokens inside a component that I'm going to name form, because it's specific, very specific. I named one border color and the other one text placeholder. It's the text that goes inside the placeholder. See that it will take for the dark mode. I didn't show it the same gray 200 value. That's for the border and for the text inside as well. With this, we would have the minimum necessary expression of the application's color system. As I said before, for a system as small as this, we could also create tokens for these other components, which makes it much easier to understand. For example, we've clearly identified the title that goes on the hero image, the color. So if we want to change that color, which was using the same title on image token, we can change it here directly and separate the title on image token from the hero title. That is, we can start to make them independent. So that, for example, this color can be different from this color here, from this color here, and from this one here. Well, the same for the others. For the banner, for example, which was not necessary, and for the attraction cards, which were not necessary either. I marked here everything that in principle would not really be necessary. And here what's only in these two rows, the ones that repeat exactly the same value. Later we'll see why this might be of interest to us.
Bueno, ahora nos queda por
Well,
ver cómo
we
se va
still have to
todo
see how
esto a
to take
Genex.
all this to
Pero como
Genexus.
este video ya me quedó
But as this
larguísimo,
video is
voy
already
a
very
dejar por
long,
acá y
I'll stop
seguimos en
here
el
and
siguiente.
continue in the next one.